Sergeant Alex O'Connor stood silently, surveying his team as they prepared for the mission. His face was hard, chiseled by years of war, and his eyes carried the weight of too many battles. His reputation for being unflinchingly focused on his objectives had earned him respect among his peers, but also a sense of distance. War had become routine for Alex, a familiar but grim dance where survival meant staying emotionally detached. As he checked his gear, his thoughts were far away, lingering on past missions that had gone sideways, friends who hadn't made it back. He pushed those memories down. He had a job to do. The enemy was brutal, the Dreadhawks, an alien faction known for their savage cruelty. They enslaved weaker races, stripping entire planets of their people, their culture, their hope. Alex had encountered them before. He knew what they were capable of. His team's mission was clear: infiltrate a Dreadhawk prison camp, neutralize any hostiles, and rescue a group of prisoners, important figures who could turn the tide of the war if they survived. There was no room for error. As his team moved out, Alex led them through hostile terrain, his senses alert to every sound, every shadow. The landscape was harsh, jagged cliffs and craters left by previous battles, now nothing more than scars on an already wounded world. The air felt heavy with tension, but his team trusted him to guide them through. Alex had always been good at keeping them alive. That was his purpose now. They moved like shadows, silently evading Dreadhawk patrols, using the natural cover of the terrain. Every movement was calculated, every step deliberate. Alex's mind, trained for survival, instinctively processed every detail, mapping out routes, identifying threats. His focus was razor-sharp, but even so, the memories crept in, faces of fallen comrades, people he'd once cared about. He couldn't afford to let his mind linger on them. Not here. Not now. The prison camp came into view, a sprawling compound fortified with alien technology that glowed ominously in the fading light. The Dreadhawks were known for their sadistic ways, and Alex had no doubt that the prisoners inside were being treated with the same cruelty he'd witnessed before. His jaw clenched, and the familiar anger he always buried rose for a brief moment. He couldn't let it take over. This was about the mission. His team breached the perimeter quickly and efficiently, taking out the guards with swift, silent precision. The camp was eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of a Dreadhawk guard's footsteps, which were quickly silenced by one of Alex's men. They moved through the dark corridors, systematically clearing rooms, freeing prisoners who were too weak to speak but whose eyes held the gratitude that Alex had seen so many times before. They were close to the high-priority targets, but something felt off. The tension in the air was palpable. As they cleared another cell block, they stumbled upon something unexpected. Lying in the corner of a dimly lit cell was a figure unlike the others. She wasn't human. The alien woman was barely alive, her breathing shallow, her skin a pale shade of blue that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, evidence of the torture she had endured. Alex stopped, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. There was something different about her. Something dangerous. He hesitated. She wasn't part of the mission, and her species had been associated with the Dreadhawks in the past. For all he knew, she could be a spy, or worse, a weapon. But something about the way she lay there, fragile and broken, made him pause. His instincts told him to leave her. His heart, though buried deep beneath layers of war-hardened armor, whispered something else. His fingers brushed against the bars of the cell, and suddenly, a wave of emotion hit him. Pain. Deep, overwhelming pain. It wasn't his. It was hers. The alien woman was projecting her emotions. He could feel her suffering as if it were his own. He recoiled, confused and wary. He'd never experienced anything like it before. For the first time in a long time, Alex wasn't sure what to do. The woman stirred, her eyes barely open. She looked at him, and in that brief moment, something passed between them. A silent plea, not for survival, but for release from the torment she'd endured. Against his better judgment, Alex made the decision. "We take her with us." His team reacted immediately, some with shock, others with concern. "We can't bring her. one of his men argued. She could be a threat. We don't know what she's capable of. Alex's voice was steady, commanding. I'll take responsibility. She's coming with us. There were no more arguments after that. His team knew better than to question his decisions once they were made. They gathered the alien woman, who was barely conscious, and continued with the mission, though the weight of their new responsibility hung heavy over them all. Alex could feel the tension in the group. They were deep behind enemy lines, carrying an unknown variable, a potential risk. But something in his gut told him that leaving her behind would be a bigger mistake. As they made their way through the camp, Alex found himself glancing back at the alien woman. Seline. That's what she'd called herself in the brief moments before she slipped into unconsciousness. He didn't know what to make of her. She wasn't like any alien he'd encountered before. Her empathic abilities had pierced through his emotional barriers with ease, and that unsettled him. No one had been able to reach that part of him in years. Yet here she was, barely alive, and already breaking down walls he hadn't realized were still there. They continued their escape, but it wasn't long before the Drathawks realized something was wrong. The alarms blared, and the cold, mechanical voice of the camp's systems echoed through the corridors, alerting every guard to their presence. Alex's team moved faster, pushing through the confusion and chaos as Drathawk forces scrambled to respond. They reached the outer perimeter, and just as Alex thought they were in the clear, a wave of enemy reinforcements descended upon them. His team fought valiantly, each soldier expertly neutralizing threats, but the odds were against them. It was during this firefight that Alex saw a glimmer of Seline's abilities again. Even in her weakened state, she was projecting calm to his team, helping them stay focused in the heat of battle. The Drathawks, on the other hand, seemed less organized, their cohesion faltering. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They managed to break through the enemy line and escape into the wilderness surrounding the camp. There was no time to stop, no time to rest. The Drathawks would be on their tail, and Alex knew they had to keep moving if they were going to make it to the extraction point alive. But with every step, Alex's mind kept returning to Seline. She was a mystery, one that he couldn't afford to dwell on right now. But deep down, he knew she wasn't just some random prisoner. She had been kept there for a reason, tortured and held against her will. The Drathawks feared her, and if they feared her, then maybe she was exactly what they needed. The escape from the prison camp was far from simple. Drathawk reinforcements were already closing in, their numbers overwhelming. Alex's team was good, some of the best in the human forces, but even they were starting to feel the pressure. Gunfire echoed through the barren landscape as the team moved swiftly, trying to stay ahead of their pursuers. It was clear they couldn't keep this up for long without something tipping the balance in their favor. Seline, still weak and barely able to walk, was slowing them down, but Alex wasn't about to leave her behind. There was something about her, something more than just the alien physiology that marked her as different. His instincts told him she wasn't a typical prisoner, and he wasn't going to ignore that gut feeling now. As they fought their way through, something strange began to happen. The Drathawk soldiers hesitated. Their previously coordinated attacks seemed to falter, as if their focus had shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just a slight hesitation in their movements, but Alex noticed. His eyes shifted to Seline. Despite her frailty, there was a quiet concentration on her face, her eyes half closed as if she were reaching out mentally, doing something beyond his understanding. He watched as the enemies seemed to lose their edge, growing confused and uncertain. It wasn't much, but in the chaos of battle, even the smallest delay could mean the difference between life and death. Alex began to piece it together. She was using her empathic abilities, subtly manipulating the emotions of the Drathawk forces. It wasn't enough to completely incapacitate them, but it was buying his team valuable time. He didn't know the full extent of her powers, and he wasn't sure he trusted them yet, but there was no denying their effectiveness. She was helping them, and that made her an asset in this fight. Despite this advantage, the Drathawks kept coming. They were relentless, a constant reminder that the danger was far from over. Alex pushed his team forward, keeping Seline close, unwilling to let her out of his sight. There was something about protecting her that triggered a shift in him. She wasn't just another mission objective anymore. It was deeper than that. As the team finally found a moment of respite, a brief lull in the fighting allowed them to catch their breath. Seline collapsed, her energy drained from the exertion of using her powers. Alex knelt beside her, helping her sit up, but her gaze went straight through him, as if she was looking at something beyond the physical world. Slowly, he began to feel it again, the gentle, probing sensation of her emotions reaching into him. But this time, it wasn't about her pain. It was about his. He hadn't realized how much weight he'd been carrying, the years of combat, the endless loss, the comrades he'd buried along the way. Seline was unraveling it, layer by layer, bringing it all to the surface. His body tensed as memories of battles long past flooded his mind. The screams of fallen friends, the moments he had barely survived, the guilt of those he couldn't save. He hadn't let himself feel these things in years, too focused on staying alive to deal with the emotional fallout. But Seline wasn't giving him a choice. Her empathic powers weren't just passive, they were peeling back the armor he had built around his emotions. Alex clenched his fists, trying to resist the flood of memories, but Celine's influence was too strong. She wasn't forcing him to relive these moments, but she was guiding him through them, showing him that it was okay to feel the pain he had buried for so long. It was disorienting at first, the vulnerability she brought out in him. He hadn't allowed himself to be vulnerable in years. But as she guided him through his trauma, a strange thing happened, he began to feel lighter. The faces of his fallen comrades became clearer in his mind, but this time, it wasn't just about their deaths. He remembered their laughter, their camaraderie, the bonds they had shared. For the first time in a long time, he let himself remember the good along with the bad. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He glanced at Seline, her eyes barely open but still fixed on him. She was healing him, not just physically, but emotionally. The walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crumble, and for the first time in years, he felt a connection to someone else. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. Alex wasn't used to feeling this way, especially not about an alien he had known for such a short time, but there was no denying it. She was reaching parts of him that he had thought were long dead. As they prepared to move again, Alex found himself staying closer to Seline, keeping a protective hand on her as they navigated through the wilderness. The bond between them was growing stronger with each passing moment. He couldn't explain it, but there was a connection forming, something that went beyond the battlefield. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about her. And that realization hit him harder than any bullet ever could. The more they traveled, the more he noticed how her presence seemed to affect the team. Despite their dire situation, the team was more focused, more cohesive. Alex knew that was Celine's doing. Her abilities weren't just about manipulating emotions in their enemies. She was helping his team stay grounded, keeping them calm and sharp in the midst of chaos. It was a subtle influence, but it was making a difference. But not everyone trusted her. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Harris, was growing increasingly wary of Seline. He had seen what she could do, and while he couldn't deny her usefulness, there was an unease in his eyes every time he looked at her. "She's dangerous," Harris whispered to Alex during one of their brief stops. "We don't know the full extent of her powers. For all we know, she's playing us." Alex understood Harris's concerns. There was a part of him that still held the same doubts. But every time he looked at Seline, saw the exhaustion and vulnerability in her, he couldn't believe she was a threat. She was helping them, and that was all that mattered right now. "She's with us," Alex replied firmly. "We wouldn't have made it this far without her." Harris didn't argue further, but the tension between them was palpable. Alex knew he was taking a risk by trusting Seline, but at this point, he had no other choice. The Draathawks were closing in, and without her, they wouldn't stand a chance. As they pushed forward, the terrain grew more treacherous, and the Draathawk forces seemed to be everywhere. Yet through it all, Alex felt a new sense of determination. Protecting Seline had given him purpose again, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting for her, and that gave him a reason to keep going. Seline, in turn, seemed to sense his growing protectiveness. She didn't say much, her energy was too depleted for conversation, but there was a quiet understanding between them. She knew what he was doing for her, and in her own way, she was grateful. The more they worked together, the stronger their bond became. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something Alex hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For the first time since the war began, he felt like he was fighting for more than just the mission. He was fighting for someone he cared about, someone who had become important to him in ways he hadn't expected. As they continued their escape, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that Seline was more than just a prisoner. She was changing him, healing him in ways he hadn't thought possible. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. They had finally reached a temporary safe zone, a place far enough from the immediate threat of the Dreadhawks that they could catch their breath. It wasn't much, a ruined building on the edge of a scorched wasteland, but it provided shelter. Alex's team gathered inside, checking weapons, tending to wounds, and laying out plans for the next steps. But Alex's focus wasn't on the mission anymore. It was on Seline. She was recovering, though the signs of what she had endured were still evident. Physically, her wounds were healing, but emotionally, the damage ran deeper. Alex sat beside her, his usual stoic demeanor softened as he watched her. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something other than the cold focus of battle. He had been hardened by years of conflict, but now, in this quiet moment, he realized how much she had affected him. The walls he had spent so long building had started to crumble, and it terrified him. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to care so deeply about her. The bond between them had grown in ways he couldn't explain. She wasn't just a mission objective or a survivor. She was important. More than he'd like to admit, even to himself. He could feel it now, the weight of it, and it scared him. Caring about someone in a war like this, it only led to pain. But there was no denying it anymore. He was in too deep. She stirred, her eyes opening, and for a moment they locked gazes. In that silent exchange, so much was said. He didn't need to speak for her to understand, and that, more than anything, shook him. The connection between them was unlike anything he had experienced before. It went beyond words, beyond the circumstances that had thrown them together. She saw him, truly saw him, in a way no one else ever had. But the moment was fleeting. There was still too much unsaid, and soon, the conversation they had been avoiding had to happen. Seline turned to him, her expression shifting from quiet exhaustion to something more resolute. She had been holding back, keeping secrets, and Alex could see the weight of those secrets pressing down on her. She took a breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. Then she told him the truth about her powers. The Dreadhawks hadn't just tortured her, they had experimented on her people, unlocking abilities that went far beyond empathy. Her race had always been known for their ability to influence emotions, but what the Dreadhawks had done, it had changed her. Now, she could do much more than control emotions. She could manipulate energy, matter itself. It was a power far greater than she had ever imagined, and it terrified her. Alex listened, trying to process the magnitude of what she was saying. This power wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. One that could end the war in a single, devastating blow. But there was a catch. Using that power would cost her everything. The strain it would put on her would be too much to survive. She could end the war, but it would mean sacrificing herself. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of this impossible situation. He didn't want to lose her. Not after everything they had been through. But the reality was staring him in the face. If she didn't use her power, the war would rage on, countless more lives lost in the process. If she did, she would be gone. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the weight of the decision she was about to make. She wasn't asking for his permission, but he could tell that his reaction mattered. She needed to know that he understood. That he wouldn't stop her. But Alex couldn't accept it. Not yet. He couldn't let her throw her life away, not when they had come this far. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice more desperate than he intended. "We can find another solution. You don't have to do this." Seline shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "If I don't, the war will never end. Too many have already died. I can stop this, Alex. But I need you to let me go." The pain in her voice was palpable, and Alex felt his chest tighten. He wanted to be selfish. He wanted to tell her to stay, to find another way, even if it meant the war continued. But deep down, he knew she was right. This wasn't about him. It was about something much bigger. And that realization tore him apart. Before he could say anything more, the ground shook beneath them. The Drathawks had found them. The final assault was coming, and there was no time left. Seline stood, her body still weak but her resolve unshakable. Alex could see the change in her. This was it. She had made her choice. The team scrambled to prepare for the attack, but Alex knew that without Seline, they didn't stand a chance. As the Drathawk forces closed in, she stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a power he had never seen before. It radiated from her, a force so strong it made the air around her hum with energy. The battle erupted around them, but Alex's focus was entirely on Seline. She was tapping into her full potential, and he could see the strain it was putting on her. Her body trembled under the weight of the power coursing through her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The Drathawk forces were relentless, but they were no match for Seline. With a wave of her hand, she sent shockwaves of energy through their ranks, dismantling their weapons, breaking their lines. It was awe-inspiring and terrifying all at once. But Alex wasn't in awe. He was terrified, for her. He knew what this was costing her, and he could see the life draining from her with every pulse of power she unleashed. He tried to reach her, tried to stop her, but she turned to him, her expression filled with a quiet resignation. "This is the only way," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "I'm sorry." Alex's heart shattered in that moment, but there was nothing he could do. He watched helplessly as she continued to fight, each burst of power bringing her closer to the end. The Drathawks were falling back, their forces decimated by her abilities, but at what cost? The final blow came, a surge of energy that rippled across the battlefield, obliterating the last of the Drathawk forces. And then, silence. Seline collapsed, her body crumpling to the ground. Alex rushed to her side, but it was too late. She was gone. He held her in his arms, the weight of her sacrifice pressing down on him like a physical force. She had saved them all. She had ended the war. But in doing so, she had left him alone. The aftermath of the battle was a blur. The war was over, but Alex couldn't feel anything but the hollow ache of loss. Seline was gone, and with her, the one thing that had brought him back from the brink of emotional numbness. She had healed him, made him whole again, only to leave him shattered. As he stood over her grave, the weight of her sacrifice settled over him. He would carry her memory with him for the rest of his life, her presence forever etched into the person he had become. She had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible, and now, he was left to carry on without her. The war was over, but the cost had been too high. Alex was free of the emotional scars that had once haunted him, but in their place was a new kind of pain. The pain of losing the one person who had truly understood him.